Kicking with Jack Tame. Jack, hello, sir. We are live with Jack Tame in managed isolation in Hamilton. Am I correct in saying Hamilton?
Yes.
Why?
Hey, kitty roa aho. Yeah, I'm in Hamilton.
By
you
choice?
Don't get any choice, obviously.
Oh, okay. So it's not by choice. That's
Nah.
where you're stuck.
But you know what, though? When I landed, everyone was moaning. Not everyone was moaning. That's not true. But the cop comes on the plane, right, when you land, and takes over the little speaker from the air hostesses. And he comes on and goes, "Hi everyone, I'm Sergeant so and so from the Auckland Police. I'm here representing the New Zealand government. I'll be helping you through the managed isolation process. You'll be getting off this plane and getting on a bus to Hamilton." And you could sort of feel everyone was like, "Ugh." But the truth is, but mainly because we had to go on a bus. Like when you've been on a plane for 13 hours, you don't want to get on a bus. But we got here, and there are definitely fancy hotels in the world. It's not 5-star, but it's honestly been great. It's been totally fine. And I think the hotel that I'm in has one of the biggest exercise areas.
Right.
So, like there are some places where you can only, walk about 15 or 20 meters before you have to turn around. And here you can walk for a loop of about 200 meters, which is actually not nothing. So, when we arrived here, the army guys who are running this place were like, "Hey, we know you're tired. You've been on a plane. You've been on a bus, but actually, you've done pretty well. You've lucked in here because you're going to be able to walk a whole lot more than a lot of other people."
Gee, when you hear things like that, I mean, I hope Laura Ingham's not picking up on this podcast. I'm sure she's not. She's a frequent viewer, but I'm sure she'll miss this one. When you hear about the fucking police getting onto the plane and the army looking after you at the thing, you kind of go, "Gosh, you can see how someone might get the wrong end of the stick if they didn't get the full context of what this thing is."
Yeah, although it's embarrassing though how far everyone seems to go out of their way to make you feel incredibly welcome. Like people are comically nice throughout this process. Have been comically nice throughout this entire process. So I really just feel I'm not going to moan about anything because people have just gone out of their way to be nice. And like all the army guys, they're actually, you can see why they're a good option running these things because they're all about systems, right? They're all about organization. And so it's a big logistical exercise. So our hotel, for example, is separated into 5 different wings. And those wings aren't supposed to cross over. So every day or every night at dinner, I get a little piece of paper that says, "Tomorrow, your wings outside time is 8 until 9 and then 3 until 4. And then someone else in a different wing would have different times. And then those times change every day. And then it says, "Oh, these are the times that you've got to go and see the nurse to, have your temperature taken and ask if you've got any symptoms," those sorts of things. So, and then you've got, in this hotel, food for 160 people, some with dietary requirements and all that sort of thing. So you can see why having the army, which are very like structure, system, organizational processes, is actually quite a sensible decision. And they're all lovely. Yeah, everyone's super nice and joking around and stuff. So it's all good.
And I'm assuming they have those 5 wings. It's a bit, funnily enough, a bit like how during COVID, TVNZ had the 2 teams. Means if there's an infection that comes up in one of those areas, if it was to break through, it's only going to go through 1/5 of the people, no further, because there's never the crossover.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And you can, I mean, it's just a way of, you still got to socially distance. So like no one I don't, come within a few meters of anyone from my wing. But the idea is that you still, I think it just makes it easier for managing people throughout the day as well. So you've kind of got big bubbles, but you also can just, it's easier so you don't have everyone turning up, lining up to see the nurse at the same time or lining up to go for a walk at the same time. You can kind of stagger it throughout the day. So it makes a lot of sense. But, I look at the logistics involved just with running this place, and then I think, oh, shit, we've got 32 of these around the country. It's a big it's a big effort. And I've been like critical of the government for a few stuff ups, like not testing frontline workers, which I still think is totally unacceptable. But, and I think they've hopefully sorted that sort of stuff out. But I can still see that it is a big logistical exercise to get this sort of stuff up and running.
With the stuff you've got to do each day, like the temperature, nurse, food, exercise, does it also mean you feel like it's not like you're just sitting in your room doing nothing? Is there enough going on within the facility that you have to do that you've kind of got enough of a timetable that you're not too bored?
This is it. You've actually got appointments, eh?
Yeah.
So like I never go more than a few hours without having something on. It's never like, oh, I've got to do 10 hours except for overnight, 10 hours in my room. You know, like I always, so you actually have, you can go for, if you want to go for like vigorous exercise, go for a run or something, you can do that before 8 o'clock in the morning. And that's, you don't, and they just restrict the number of people out there, so you don't need to do that with your wing. But then if you do that, then, you know, you've got breakfast at 8 o'clock. And then you've probably got to walk sometime between 9 o'clock and midday or 8 o'clock and midday. And then you've got lunch. And then you've probably got another walk or a visit to the nurse sometime that afternoon before dinner. So you've always got little things every couple of hours. It's actually quite clever, eh? The way they kind of, you know, like your schedule comes in, your piece of paper comes in every night, and, you know, it's just blah, blah, blah. It's quite a good way of doing things.
Sounds like you're preparing yourself for a retirement village. I'm just thinking about that. Sounds exactly like a 75-year-old would do in a retirement complex. Often see the nurse and have their walking time, and so you'll be good to go, Jack.
Yeah. Get my pureed food. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Hey, tell me about the process to get into the US. Obviously, you're just back from the election. That's why you're in managed isolation. Actually entering the US, did you have any stand down there? Or is it because that's the worst place in the world, they just say, oh, you might as well come in. We're more dangerous to you?
I mean, there's nothing that New Zealand has that America doesn't have.
Okay.
So if you've got 150,000 cases a day, who cares? Like, I know that sounds ridiculous, but there are restrictions in different states, and
right.
This is probably part of the reason that America has had as many COVID infections as it's had, because states all have completely different rules. So, for example, I went into Washington DC, and because we were media, we were considered an essential service, and so we were allowed to travel around. But other people who lived in DC or Maryland or Virginia are supposed to be restricted from traveling to different states. Or if they go to different states, they're supposed to then self-isolate for 2 weeks. But of course, you know, do people do that? I don't know. But I on one occasion, I did go from, so Washington, D.C. and New York have similar case levels. So anyone's allowed to travel between those two cities at the moment.
Right.
And I was in New York very briefly. And when I got to New York, there were police officers checking people's tickets to see where they'd come from.
Wow.
And so I guess theoretically, those police officers could have been like, oh, no, you're from elsewhere, you know, you're from wherever, North Carolina, some other state that didn't have the same arrangement, and they could have said, get out of here or whatever. But no, it's like, to go to America, I went to the airport, nothing's open at the airport, I got on a plane, I flew to America, that was it.
And you've been obviously US correspondent, and you've done elections before in America. What was the vibe for you? What did it feel like being in America, where there is at the moment 1,500 people dying a day, and like you say, 150,000 cases a day at the moment? Like, not so much the political vibe, but just living and being in America from someone who was, you know, a part resident there fairly recently. Yeah. What did it feel like?
I mean, the thing that surprised me is just the range of responses that COVID seems to be eliciting in Americans. So, for example, I was in contact with one person who literally refused to leave their house. They're right. Like, no, I just will not go out. I'm immune compromised, whatever. There's absolutely no way I'm going to leave my house. And that was in DC, which again has, compared to some other places in the US, relatively low, you know, case numbers. But then, you know, I went to West Virginia, and you know, I maybe saw one person wearing a mask when I was in West Virginia. And, you know, I went to a local shop and I was wearing a mask, and I said, oh, you know, you guys obviously not too worried about COVID. And they said, oh, yeah, well, you know, what will be, will be. And I said, do you know anyone who's been affected? I asked this guy if he knew anyone who'd been affected. And he said, oh, yeah, I've had a couple of friends die from the virus.
Wow.
And I was like, okay. no one's wearing a mask. Like, okay, whatever, you know. And then, you know, like in New York, for example, almost everyone's wearing a mask outside all the time. And perhaps that's because, because the city had such a high infection rate earlier this year that they've kind of been shocked into it. But, yeah, my experience was that people just had vastly different approaches to it all. And, you know, like even flying there, you know, we were flying and there were people literally wearing boiler suits, like you see the forensic investigators after a grisly murder.
Yeah.
They were wearing those
Wow.
with like full face masks and everything. But then there were other people who weren't even wearing masks. Yeah, so it was quite bizarre. But we were quite paranoid, my cameraman and I, for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, we just didn't want COVID, because you don't want COVID. Second of all, we knew, like if we had contracted it early in the trip and had to stand down for a long period in a hotel, that would be like a massive waste of resource and money and that sort of thing. And so we were, we kind of had systems developed from the word go, and we'd done this massive health and safety plan. You can imagine what it was like to even get the sign off from work.
Yeah.
And but we did, like, we were just, we just hand sanitized all the time. We had hand sanitizer in the car, hand sanitizer, wipes everywhere. Every time we'd go and interview someone, we'd get back to the car, start from zero, wipe everything down with hands, all that sort of stuff. But you can still see, for all of that, you could still see how there were chinks in the armor. I don't think human beings are wired to be 100% alert to that kind of unseeable risk 24/7. And, so even with all of the protections we were taking, and we had N95 masks up the wazoo and all that sort of thing, you could still see just a little mistake and you stuff up.
Well, like, I mean, if you are putting the N95 mask up your wazoo, that could be one of the mistakes, Jack, just in case. Maybe next time.
Yeah, I misread the instructions.
Hey, was there ever a thought of not going? Like the meeting at TVNZ is going like, fuck, are we going to go? And if we're going to go, who's going to go? How did that pan out?
I mean, so I put together a pitch from quite early on, and our correspondent over there, our US correspondent, Anna Burns-Francis, had been there for a couple of months. And so I don't want to say she was the guinea pig, but she was, I guess, kind of a guinea pig in a sense. But I mean, we had to. TVNZ was very supportive of me going, actually,
right.
for a couple of reasons. Like I had a story plan put together, and I was hoping to get this interview with Chris Liddell, the Kiwi in the White House, that I'd been talking to him for a long time, and he'd said to me, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen in the days after the election in DC. And so, I was really, look, journos want to be in the middle of things, right? And I love the feeling of being in the biggest story in the world. And I love the feeling of being in a place and in a moment where the whole world's attention is focused. And so I just desperately wanted to go. And to be honest, from TVNZ's perspective, I mean, if you're going to have a second person over there, a second reporter as well as the correspondent who's based there,
mm-hmm.
I'm the sort of person who would make sense. I've got experience there. Got lots of experience working overseas. I lived in the US for years. I've got lots of contacts. I know how the place works, all that stuff. But also, I don't have a family. So I'm not, so taking 5 weeks out.
You're not trying to say like, so you're expendable, are you, Jack? You're like, so I'm expendable.
No, I'm not trying to say I'm expendable, but so yeah, I mean, I was really keen, and to be honest, they were pretty supportive from the word go. So
also, I would also imagine younger as well. I mean, like if you look at the stats around COVID, if one was to get it, you'd rather a 30-something get it than a 60-something.
Yeah, I don't know if there was a 94-year-old with comorbidities, if TVNZ would be rushing to put them on the first plane to the US. So I'm sure that was a factor, but compared to other trips, the health and safety plan was pretty exhaustive. And I should say it wasn't just COVID. They sign up to the kind of international alert systems and stuff, and there was a lot of concern going into the election, as you'll remember, just about civil violence and riots and how what might happen after the election if militia would move. All those sorts of things were kind of unknowns and were perceived as being legitimate risks. So there was a lot to kind of weigh up.
Remind me, I knew because my brain is mush because it's 2020 and that all our brains are. Because I watched TVNZ on that was the I was watching TVNZ and I was watching CNN mostly. Where were you? Which camp were you in?
I was in Biden's camp.
And tell me about the night. Tell me about the election night.
I mean, it was pretty underwhelming, to be honest. I think for everyone. Because for the longest time we didn't know where either was going to be, but then going into the election we were saying, oh look, it's it's likely we're not going to know the result tonight. Likely we're not going to know the result tonight. But everyone sort of forgot that on the night itself, right? Because of all the 100 million early votes, the whole process was going to take longer.
Yeah.
But I hadn't kind of forgotten it. So I drove up from DC to Delaware, a couple of hours, and and we had credentials basically to go outside at the Biden camp, waiting for him to turn up, and we were watching the results come in like everyone else. I think we were watching CNN because I was with the Associated Press, which is kind of like they have all the press areas set up, and if you get credentialed with the AP like we do, then you basically pay for little live slots and can go in. And so I'll do my thing for TVNZ, and then I'll immediately step out, and a French reporter will step into the slot and take over, and then an Italian will step in, and it's like a little United Nations there. And I did a few crosses, and then we were just kind of waiting for the results. Everything was very inconclusive, and then Biden came out very late and did a very short speech. So before he turned out, they let in a few supporters. Basically, I would guess 40 or 50 cars worth of supporters in a drive-in event, because they didn't want to have anything with, where COVID could be spread. And they all just came in. They were all, checked off by the Secret Service as they came in. Biden went up. He was behind bulletproof glass. And he spoke for about 3 minutes and said, feel good about where we're at. And that was it. And then, of course, we watched as Trump came out and kind of just started disputing the election's legitimacy quite early on.
Even though he had quite a big lead at that point, he still started doing it.
Well, yeah. The funny thing was, going into the election, everyone was saying, this election's going to be different. All of the election officials were saying it's going to take us time to count these votes. And I'd spoken to Republicans who were like, we think that early votes and mail-in votes will favour Biden 3-1, and everyone just kind of forgot that. Or a lot of people seem to forget that on the night. And the problem is that the cable networks, especially, are desperate for storylines, desperate for analysis, but you didn't get a clear picture in the way that you might in a more conventional election where everyone was voting on election day itself. And so, but and then so the next morning I hightailed it back to DC and spent the rest of my time there because there wasn't much happening in Delaware. Yeah,
it's sort of interesting how it's such a juxtaposition as to what happened in New Zealand on election night. Kind of felt like about 8:30 in the evening, it was all sort of done. I mean, the final thing.
The New Zealand election was done at about 7:15. The first results came in, 1% of the vote counted. I remember thinking with the 1% of the vote, they were like, there's only 1%. You don't want to read too much into it. And I was like, 1% is like a sample size 50 times higher than any of the polls that we go on.
Yeah.
So it's probably going to be reasonably accurate. So very different.
Hey, I want to talk to you a little bit, and I know you've got to go get a swab stuck up your nose at 25:02. So we've got about 12 or 13 minutes before we've got to let you go. The Chris Liddell conversation, I'm fascinated to get your thoughts on this, and I'm hoping maybe some people might be interested in getting some thoughts on how this whole thing works as well, because let me do what we always do and bring up a little bit of this is a tweet that you sent out. I don't know whether this was on the day of the interview or beforehand, but you put out a tweet to kind of give people a heads up about the interview. And for those who are listening, the tweet says, in the interest of transparency, Chris Liddell and I agreed on the subjects. Given his ongoing role as transition manager and Trump's fraud claims, Chris would make no comment whatsoever about anything that could impact the transition. The interview was 50 minutes and we will broadcast it all. So that was kind of cool, because as I was watching it, I was kind of going, gosh, why wasn't Jack pushing back a little bit more about the odd thing here and there? But there was obviously like a what do you call it? A rules of engagement set up beforehand. But was that must have been a pretty cool experience to be sitting in was it the Roosevelt room and having a chat just in that White House space?
Yeah, I mean, to be in the West Wing in that space is amazing. And I was in the Oval Office the day after the election with Chris and talking through some stuff. And the thing about the West Wing is it's fun, like it's tiny. It's and people think it's massive. It's just tiny. And, people with the biggest names have the smallest offices because everything in DC comes down to proximity. So, for example, Like Jared Kushner has a terrible office, but it's right next to the president.
Right.
So that's all that matters.
Yeah.
And like a terrible office, like
location.
like a comically bad sort of little shoebox office. But what matters is proximity. Anyway, look, I mean, the simplest way to explain things is that, so I've known Chris for a long time, and I've been trying to get an interview, get an interview with him in his time in the White House. I visited him last year in the West Wing, and then I met with him a couple of times in DC before doing the interview this time around. And it's normal that going into an interview, especially with politicians and things, I mean, with anyone really, you kind of talk about the subjects that you want to discuss. And I think that's fair enough. But I was also like acutely aware with the interview with Chris Liddell, as transition manager, there was a he was in this position where he's trying to balance up the president and Donald Trump's, kind of state with, having to transition to either a second Trump presidency or to the Biden presidency. And it's objectively an incredibly tenuous position, right? This is just this astonishingly contentious moment in political history. And Chris is one of the key figures in the middle, which is to say that if I put vast pressure on him to express opinions or give details about the transition, those comments could be construed by either side, depending on what he would say, to negatively impact the transition,
right?
To compromise it in a massive way. And he was like, look, if there is any, basically, if we are going to go into this, I just can't do the interview. I just cannot do the interview if we go into this in a really big way. I can't do anything that will compromise that. And I respect that. I respected that, explanation and the circumstances. If it had been a blowout win to Trump or a blowout loss to Trump or whatever, and the result hadn't been contentious, then it might have been a different story. Indeed, we'd kind of, talked about different ways of doing things and different things we might be able to show in the White House and all of that sort of stuff. But just given that moment in time and given his role, he was like, look, it's basically like this or nothing.
Yeah.
And I can, whereas, I can absolutely empathize with people who want to see me go with him and all of those sorts of things. I actually thought a couple of things. First of all, I thought, it is reasonable that this person in this position, doesn't want to do anything to compromise the transition, regardless of what administration took over. But also, New Zealanders haven't heard from this guy when he was in the office, and I did think it was a really good opportunity to actually just let him speak and not make the focus of the interview be me, and not push him as I would perhaps a cabinet minister or someone who was elected to the position by New Zealanders or anything like that, but actually to let the guy speak. And people will interpret that however they want to interpret it. But I feel really comfortable about the way I handled the interview in that moment, in that very kind of unique little window that we are in right now. And I still think we learned a lot from the interview. I think we learned heaps from the interview, and actually, letting Chris speak and giving him the space to speak, I think was a good decision.
What was the date of the interview? It was broadcast on about the 15th. I was interested in that because Joe Biden was sort of started to be called, the next president. What's the word? The word just jumped out of my head. The
president-elect.
President-elect. Sorry, that's the right one. From about the 7th of November. So that's even more interesting. So
it was on we recorded on New Zealand time the 10th, but it was the 9th in DC.
So that was when he'd already started being called president-elect, and still there was no conversations around transition. I was also wondering,
I did, to be fair, I did actually ask him about the transition.
Yeah, you pushed back once on that, didn't you?
yeah, I said, like, how do you see this playing out? Da, 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 da. And he said, oh, well, look, I'm optimistic. The sun comes out every day. We'll see how things go. And I said, how will this end? And I said, how do you think it'll end? And he said,
I got that.
I just cannot go there. I cannot go there.
Yeah, so I wonder if he was like, hey, in his head, he was like, no, Jack, we've talked about this. I'm not talking about this.
Yeah.
I wonder, did you get the vibe that he believes, we all sometimes, especially if you're a, like anything from a PA to someone through to a diplomat for a country, there's sometimes you play the game, sometimes there's things that you believe. Like, I was interested in some of the things he was saying if he actually believed, and one of the ones was, he was talking about Trump being fearless. And maybe it's me, maybe it's my bias, maybe it's me looking from the outside in, but I don't think Trump's fearless. I think Trump's a bit of a coward who tends to run away from conflict when it's out there. Do you think that that Chris was someone who was believing what he was saying, or was there some diplomating going on there and he was using the words, let's say, they often talk about that this was a broadcast for an audience of one, in case Trump saw what he had said, he was also saying the right things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he was conscious of that. I'm sure he was conscious of not wanting to critique his boss. But I also think that I think Chris looks at it as not being a binary thing. And like, I agree with Chris in so much as I think in New Zealand, we have sometimes a very two-dimensional impression of Trump, in that we go, Trump, he's offensive and he says racist things and he says things and all of these things. And we just go, oh, well, if you support him, then you must be racist, hillbilly from backwater, blah, 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 blah. And I think that Chris is right in that Trump's appeal is far, far more complex than that kind of two-dimensional image that we have of him in New Zealand.
I agree.
Kind of allows.
Yep.
And I think that's Chris's big thing. Like, Chris would say, I'm sure, that he's like, look at my politics, like his passions are like inequality and climate change. I mean, he was one of the founders of the Next Foundation, which is backing the predator-free New Zealand 2050. Like, that's his driving passion.
Yeah.
So how do you reckon with working for an administration that has kind of undermined, like
who's pushing coal? Yeah.
And coal and those things. Well, I mean, that's for Chris to answer and for Chris to kind of reconcile. Only he will know whether or not he can reconcile that. But I think he would argue that that the administration has done a lot of good, and whereas he doesn't agree with a lot of what the president, or some of what the president does, and his behaviour sometimes, he had this really interesting line. Again, I think just giving him space to speak was good in this respect. But he said, every day, everyone who works for this administration gets up and does an analysis. Am I still sufficiently aligned with the goals of the White House and the goals of Donald Trump and his agenda to put up with the things that I disagree with?
Yeah.
And if I'm not, then I leave. But if I am, then I go to work. And Chris is like, so there it is. I do that analysis. I'm comfortable with it. I go to work.
Two more quick questions for you. We've got about three minutes left. The first, I think you already answered, so I won't ask it to you actually. It was just going to be, how did you decide to have it as a long form interview? I mean, so much in media these days, especially on TV, you hear about snackable, bite-sized morsels, easy. But what you've already said is, we haven't heard from him, so it was good to give him the time. I'm assuming that's basically the same answer for the decision about a long form.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I would have happily given him 3 hours.
Yeah.
And like I get it's not for everyone. I get that not everyone has the appetite for an interview like that. But in the same way that you and I are speaking now, there is actually, I think, creating space, and especially on a show like Q&A. Ours is we're publicly funded, and we kind of strive to make stuff slightly more thoughtful, than snackable media necessarily.
Yeah.
So I thought, for me, it was it was kind of a no-brainer. I should say, most New Zealand politicians would refuse to do an hour-long interview.
I know.
and look, I could be wrong, but I would be stunned. I would be stunned if the Prime Minister, for example, agreed to an hour-long interview.
Yeah, no, I can.
I would love to do more of them, but it doesn't work like that.
I can attest to that, and specifically the Prime Minister's office. Last question for you, then, bro, because I know you got to go get a swab up your nose. It's 2 weeks later since that interview, right? It's exactly 2 weeks later. It's the 24th today, month till Christmas Eve. Freaky. There appears to be, or at least there's some commentary that say there's an obvious coup attempt happening in America at the moment. How would you approach the Chris Liddell interview differently today, with 2 more weeks of what's been going on with the transition, non-transition, than you did then?
I don't think I would. I don't think I would. I mean, it was pretty clear, right? Like it was you agree to not going into his role in the transition, his thoughts on the transition and stuff, or there's no interview, you know. And I still think that, and this is why I laid it out. You know, this is why I laid it out for the audience. I want to be transparent with my audience, you know, so they know exactly. So they're not just sitting there going, "Well, why aren't you asking about the transition?" But I still think, although obviously we all would like to know all about the transition, I still think there is so much to learn from someone like that in an interview space, that it's a better option to agree to those parameters and make it clear to the audience that those are the parameters you've agreed to, than to have nothing at all.
Yeah. No, look,
I mean, look, there'll be people who disagree with that, but it's like, you know, okay, what would you do if you were in my position? You know?
Yeah.
And I still, I mean, I you know, I went there, I've watched that interview about 5 times. I think it's fascinating. Well, and I've had a whole range of feedback from people who say, "Oh, you should never have put Chris Liddell on TV," blah blah blah. To, you know, a lot of people message me and just say, "Shit, it was fascinating to hear from that guy." You know, in this moment of all moments. So yeah, I don't think I would necessarily approach it any differently.
Well, and the other thing is, you're now proving yourself trustworthy to Chris, that you'll stick by what you say, and then when you get the chance to interview him next time, you can go, "Now, reflecting back on that transition, dude, what the F?" You know, you can address it on another day. Hey, look, I know you've got to go.
Yeah, these aren't the sort of things that I would like usually. You know, you're not usually in especially with elected officials. I always find a bit of a distinction with elected officials, but these aren't the sort of like parameters that I usually like lay out with, you know, and agree to with people in interviews. But this is this is a very this is a unique moment, right?
Totally.
And you know, it's not like I mean, hopefully for the sake of the world, going to find ourselves in many of these occasions where, you know, where elections are so contentious and where there is a New Zealander at the heart of things. So, you know, if by sticking to these parameters this time mean that we, you know, have better access to full details in the future, then, you know, then that would be great. But I also think, like, it's, you know, it's that or nothing, and people are unreasonable if they don't see that.
Yeah, and
because I laid out the parameters.
There's not even the full disclosure in the future. It's, would you like 80% access now or none at all? So, like, we'll take the 80.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. That's a very succinct way of putting it.
Are you going to pass your COVID test today? And if you do, when you're out of isolation?
I believe so, and that means I'll be out in less than 48 hours.
Woohoo! Back on a bus to Auckland?
Yeah, bus back to Auckland, and then I'll go straight to the office.
Hey, Jack, thanks for joining us. Good luck with your test today. I'm sure we'll see a headline news item if you don't pass it, but I'm sure you look and sound and feel great, and I'm sure it'll be not a problem. So thanks again for joining us super quick. It was a fascinating little chat into what happened with you in America, and I'm jealous you got to go over there. I'm sure you were like, when you were in the West Wing, I wonder if Trump will just stick his head around the corner just to say hello, but well, maybe next time.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much.
All right, dude. All the best. Be safe.
Go back.